So, so early on, we had these tribes. That's how it started. They were family groups. That's how human beings operated in the world as they gathered what they could. They were nomads. They wandered from place to place so that they could eke out their living. Right? And they were trying to figure out what's happening. Is there, was there magic? So they would do things like hold sacrifices. Why? Because they felt like that might be sympathetic magic. Right? So they had magical ideas about how God worked with the world, and that was true all over the world. Right? And these tribal cultures all had their own stories. They had the stories about the leader of their family, the origin of their family, so on and so forth. Well, at a certain point in history, tribes wasn't the best way to go. Because at least in the Near East, when in the Far East, Middle East, good heavens, at least in the Middle East, the Philistines were a nation made up of many tribes, and they invaded, right? And individual tribes were wiped out because they didn't have the power, right? So you had various tribes coming together and trying to form nations out of defense. Okay, they needed to do it so that they would survive. Okay? And so, in Palestine, you had these 12 tribes, and they were the tribes of Israel, and they gathered together to form a nation. First under King Saul, and then ultimately under King David. They formed alliances that were political alliances so that they could protect themselves against invaders. Right? And what happens when you put tribes together? Well, if you're a tribe, it's easy to find out how you cohere, how you're related by blood. That's what gives you your identity. Right? So I'm a Benjaminite. That's because I'm in that bloodline. And that's what brings cohesion to a societal structure that has tribes. Okay? But when you put a bunch of tribes together that are not related by blood, then what do? Well, the answer is they begin to identify by telling stories about who they are in the presence of the Creator. So when Saul and David formed this nation to protect one another from people, particularly the Philistines, that were coming in to take over, they needed to have stories that identified and helped the group to cohere. Right? And that's how we got the first stories and the first layer of the scriptures. It's because the educated people in Saul and David's reign gathered various tribal stories together and began to weave them into cohesive narratives.
He's on the left. Okay.
Right? So if they weaved them in a cohesive narrative, that would help to give this nation some sort of identity, and particularly an identity that made sense of the world around them and how they felt that the Creator was responding to them. They're always trying to figure out, well, what's our place? What gives us strength? What gives us power? What makes us right? Or what makes us allow to be survived? So these stories were woven together, put together during the period of Saul and David's reign by the educated people, by the religious leaders that had come together as part of this whole alliance. Right? So what formed the initial layer of the scriptures was a political alliance and the need to be able to give a group of tribes a sense of identity that they could hold on to, that would keep them together so that they could protect themselves from invaders. Okay? And the first layer, as I said in my first sermon, was the J layer, the Yahwist layer. Right? Scholars have figured that out because that layer of the scriptures refers to God as Yahweh. All right? We actually assume that that's what they called him, Yahweh. But since Hebrew doesn't have vowels, we don't actually know the way they pronounced that, because they thought that the name of God was so holy that they never said it. Okay, so you have this tetragrammaton. You have these four consonants put together, all right, and scholars think that the way they pronounced it was Yahweh, but we don't really know. Have you ever heard of Jehovah? Okay, well, we got Jehovah in a funny way. We took the four Hebrew consonants, and then what the Hebrews always did is, instead of saying the name of God, they would say Adonai, which stands for Lord. Okay, it just means Lord. So Adonai. So they took the vowels from Adonai and put them on the consonants for God's name, and that's how you get Jehovah. And they just sort of stuck those two things together. Most scholars think it was actually Yahweh. All right. So this first layer referred to God as Yahweh. It's, we can tell it's sort of the controlling layer, the controlling stories that came about. Okay? And it began to identify, for instance, the purpose of the Israelite nation. All right? We're going to come back to this later, but one of the most important verses in the Bible, maybe even the most, is Genesis 12, verses 1 to 3. Now Yahweh said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I'll show you. I will make of you a great nation. I'll bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. The one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed."
Could you repeat that? We lost you partway through.
Okay. That's really unfortunate that we're losing one another. Okay. Now Yahweh said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I'll show you. I will make of you, I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing." And that's a key phrase, because the purpose that they felt they had, that this early nation felt it had, was that they were to bring the blessing of God's presence to the whole world. All right? That's their identity, it's their purpose for being. So during the kingdom of Saul and the kingdom of David and the kingdom of Solomon, this Yahwist layer was put together and laid down. Okay? After Solomon died, the tribes could not hold their alliance together. Right? And so they split in two. Now, many of you who've studied the Bible know this, so I'm kind of reviewing history for you, but I'm trying to do it in the context of how the scriptures were produced. So when they couldn't hold the alliance together, we had 10 northern tribes and 2 southern tribes that split. Okay, the southern tribes had Jerusalem, right? The northern tribes, that's where Samaria was, so on and so forth, and they split. Right? Now, the southern tribes continued to use the Yahwist layer, right? But the northern tribes also needed to have identity. They had the same project. So the kings of the northern tribes, in effect, commissioned a new layer to the Torah. It was called the Elohist layer. And they called God Elohim, which, as I mentioned, is a plural. They called God gods. All right, this swirl of forces. When you look at it, that's the sense you get of how they looked at God. All right, and later, when everything was pulled together, an editor kind of put these two things together. They tried to smooth out the stories. So if you read the story about Noah, some of that narrative is the Yahwist layer, and some of the narrative is the Elohist layer. And scholars have great fun trying to dice this all apart and figure out how it fits together. But it's clearly two layers, They were edited together at some point, and that gave us the second layer of Torah. Right? It's because these northern tribes needed identity, and it was a fight, and sometimes the 2 southern tribes and the 10 northern tribes were close, and sometimes they weren't. Right? And those things sometimes would get edited together. There was it was a long, hundreds of years long process of editing this and trying to figure it out, always asking the question, who are we, and what do we have to do with God's purpose in the world? It's always what they were asking. So, when the Assyrian Empire began to rise, that is to say, not only was it a group of tribes that formed a nation, but it was an empire that took hold of lots of nations. Okay. So where were we? We were at the 10 northern tribes and the 2 southern tribes. They were in they were in and out of relationships. Sometimes it was very tense. Sometimes there were border skirmishes, and other times they were close. All the while, their scriptures were developing, giving themselves a sense of identity and a sense of purpose with the presence of God. Then an empire arose, and empire power was a huge thing. We talked about the move from these magical tribes that got together to form a nation. Okay? And when they did, instead of being magical in their orientation, they began to think in terms of myths that held them together, that gave them identity. But then there were nations that swallowed up other nations and became empires. And those empires would just, some of them would annihilate other nations, others of them would capture them, but the Assyrians in particular, one of the first empires, would annihilate everything when they went in to take over a territory. And the Assyrians came in and they wiped out the 10 northern tribes, never to be seen from again. Right? We have remnants of them, but the 10 northern tribes were destroyed. Okay. There are lots of theories as to why that occurred in terms of God's presence in the world, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the 2 southern tribes took that as a lesson. When the 10 northern tribes were destroyed, the southern tribes decided that their problem was that the reason they were afraid of the Assyrians coming is they needed to be reformed. They needed to act in ways that would please God, because obviously the 10 northern tribes had not pleased God, because if they had, then they wouldn't have been destroyed. So at that moment in time, there was a king named Josiah, and Josiah worked to reform the nation and make it more godly. Right? And this is when Deuteronomy was written. Legend says it was found somewhere, but the reality is it was written by the leaders of the 2 southern tribes at that time under the guidance of the king. Right? And they wanted to, be good in God's eyes. So that the Deuteronomist, that is to say, the Deuteronomy tells the story of Israel as if to say, well, when the kings are good in Israel, then everything goes right. When the kings are bad in Israel, then everything goes wrong. That's true of Deuteronomy, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, and 2 Kings. All 5 of those books were written at the same time. All right? The Deuteronomist history. And it tries to say when people behave themselves and follow God's law, then things go well. If they don't, things go poorly. So the Deuteronomist is what we call this new layer, edited all of those stories together from the Yahwist layer and from the Elohist layer, and put his or her own stamp on it. Now, when I say the editor, it was a group of people talking, arguing, debating over what was going on. What was God trying to do in the world? All right. So now we have 3 layers and 5 books. Right? The southern tribes did not survive either. After the Assyrian Empire was destroyed by the Babylonian Empire, the Babylonian Empire came in and captured the 2 southern tribes. But different than Assyria, when Babylon would take over a nation, they wouldn't destroy everything. Instead, they took all the leaders, all the educated people, the priests, the kings, the teachers, anybody who was anybody, they would take and exile them. And so this was called the Great Exile. They took all these leaders out of the nation of Israel, out of those 2 southern tribes, right, and brought them to Babylon away from their own nation, right? Thus, there's nobody to rebel anymore. They don't have the leadership they need, right? And as that's going on, people are trying to figure out, well, what happened to us? Were we, that God turned our back on us? Because this was a shock. I mean, if you think about it, in Jerusalem, there was a temple on top of the hill. And what they thought was God lived in that house up there. And so if Babylon exiled everybody, clearly God was thrown out of the house. So God was not the big power. Right? Was that it? Or was it God abandoned them because they were so bad? And when they were in exile, the priests and the people, the leaders, tried to figure that out. And the priestly class came up at that time and said, we haven't been doing our sacrifices right. We haven't been honoring and keeping the law correctly, right? And so they pictured this ordered society. The priests wanted everything in order so that God's reign would be perfected and the people could then live out their purpose. So when finally the Persians took over the Babylonians, Persians had yet another way to deal with the nations that they defeated. They made allies of the leaders. So they sent everybody back home to Israel. And the leaders then rebuilt the nation of Israel. And the priests came with them. And the priests edited a new layer into Torah. Right? And it was a layer where sacrifice and order and law was extremely important. And that was the final editing. So they added their material and they edited it all together. And finally, we ended up with Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the way we have it today. I think I mentioned in the sermon that it was the priests that put in the first chapter of Genesis. That poem, the creation poem, wasn't there until the last layer of Torah came in. So that's how we got Torah. I'm going to stop here and ask, are there questions about that?
Teacher, do you have handouts?
Do I have handouts?
Yes.
I don't. I could probably find something. But what we're talking about, if you were to look up on the web, J, E, P, and D, just write JEPD, you would find plenty of stuff about these layers. Okay, why they do JEPD instead of JEDP, I'm not sure. But in any case, it's the 4-source theory of the formation of Torah.
So, Pastor, who was in the country of Palestine once the tribes were destroyed?
Wandering tribes and the people that were left, but they were annihilated, and so it was people without an identity.
And the people that were taken,
they became the Samaritans. I mean, that's part of what was left there, but they lost their identity as part of the 12 tribes.
were not they assimilated into the peoples that conquered them?
Well, sure, some of that happened as well, but how many of the conquerors stayed in that area? That's a real question.
Yeah.
The point, though, is that no longer were there 10 tribes that were identified as being part of God's work in the world. Whoever was left had a totally different identity. So they were no longer a part of the people of God within the biblical tradition. That
Thank
makes sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. This is interesting to me because let's ask another question. How does God work in the world? All of this happened because tribes needed to get together and form nations, and nations had to deal with empires. These were very political and economic issues, right? And people were trying to figure things out as they went. And so you got to ask yourself, well, okay, if Moses didn't write the first 5 books of the Bible, if they didn't come out full grown, right, that means that God is in the nitty gritty of all of that. God's in the nitty gritty of political developments and economic developments. And what that means is God's in the middle of it right now. Everything that's happening now, God is present and God is working in God's way. And I find that exhilarating. Some people object. They want God to have made everything the way it was supposed to be and laid down the law. And I just find that a little too tidy. I think it's much more exciting to think of God not as a magician, but as a God that works through everything that happens and everything that develops. Because what we're talking about here is evolution. Talking about social evolution.
Uh-oh.
It was how God works and all that.
Yeah, God works because what we're talking about is evolution. You know, I'll put my theological cards on the table. I think everything evolves. I think star systems evolve. I think plants and animals evolve. I think that economics evolves and society evolves. Morals evolve. I think everything evolves, including religion. All right? And what we're talking about here is a historical record in this book, if you can dice it out, of how religion evolved in a particular area with particular ideas about how God was interacting in the world. And to me, and everybody does it. This happened all over the world. You know, when tribes came together to form nations, they would form religions. They would form myths to be able to give themselves identity. The beauty of the Jews was this incredible theological imagination that allowed them to see the way God was actually working in the world. It's why I'm a Christian. It's because I think they get it right. I think they understood things in a way that's really helpful for us to understand. So when they looked at things unfolding, they would tell stories about how they saw God working in the world. And that to me it's just so real because it's what's happening today. I mean, is God working in our nation today?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think God is, but it's not a straight line. It wasn't a straight line in the development of these scriptures either. You know, it's about the unfolding of history. And this book says, or the way what they understand is it's unfolding towards a telos, towards a purposeful end. And the purposeful end is for us to be unified with the presence of the Creator that is evolving us. At least that's what I believe it says. which to me makes it, I guess what I'm saying is real. Because if I were to stay with just the mythic stories, this happened and that happened, in the end, I got to look around and say, well, I don't see God working like that. You know, when was the last time you saw somebody walking on water? You know, it doesn't happen. And so if I'm looking at the book and expecting it to be a magic book and tell me things like that, it disappoints. But if I look at the book and I ask, well, what was their relationship to God? What were they after as they were going
Yeah.
through? If, if I'm expecting it to be a magic book, I'll be disappointed. If I expect it to be real and I can understand the way they've been dealing with God all through their history from within their worldview. One of my favorite things in the story about Noah, after it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, it says, God closed the windows of heaven. Isn't that wonderful? That's because they thought, and it also says close the doors of the deep. All right, that's because they thought it was a flat earth and there were waters under the earth and there was a dome that was over the earth and the water was above the dome. That's, by the way, why the sky is blue, because it's water up there. Okay? And so when God wants it to rain, God opens the windows of heaven. And when God was done, God closed the windows of heaven. And the reason I think that's gorgeous and wonderful is because they told this great story from within their own worldview. We know perfectly well there are no windows in heaven. And it gives us a kind of freedom to understand what they were saying in a real way. We don't have to take their worldview. We need to listen to what they were trying to say about God and the way God reacts to us. So that's how the 5 books of Torah were developed. Any other questions about that? Does anybody here think I'm crazy?
Yeah, it's really interesting.
I think so often through hymns. And there is an old hymn that appeared in the 1940 hymnal, Presbyterian hymnal.
The red one?
No, the green one.
The green one. Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Really far back there. And the music is by Martin Shaw, but it's called God is Working His Purpose Out from East to West. And so what you're saying has given me a sense of not a static God, but a moving God.
Yeah. I really think you're right. And of course, it does have implications for how we deal with other religious traditions. Okay? Because everybody was doing this. Everybody was looking for a way to understand what was happening in the world around them. All right? And I have my father is a pastor. He's 103 years old, and he's pretty sharp. But I always have the same debate with him, over and over. You know how when folks get old enough, we repeat conversation, and Dad keeps trying to figure out if there's life on other planets. So he has a different worldview than the authors of the Bible. He's thinking there's probably life on other planets. Okay? And he says, so did God send Jesus to them? An interesting question. And I go, well, Dad, maybe, but 2,000 years ago, China might as well have been another planet. Right? And what I get from this is that God is working in all cultures to try and reveal God's self to the world around us. My wife is not a Christian. She holds to what she would call a trans-lineage faith, which is to say she thinks that the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition and the Buddhist tradition and the Hindu tradition, all of these folks were trying to figure it all out, and eventually it's all going to become one religion. All right? We're all going to sort of fit that together and it'll become one. And I think she's probably right. The difference between us is that I think she thinks it'll happen soon. I think it'll take 1,000 years. So, but everybody's wrestling with who God is and what God's doing. And 3,000 years ago, you had these tribes, magical thinking, came together as a nation, developed myths that gave them identities, and then history started taking over and they would unfold it. It's pretty cool that God can work through all of that. So, let me just go further, because once we have the 5 books, everything else is talking about those 5 books. Right? So we have first and second. We have the historical books, which is First, Second Samuel, First, Second Kings, and First, Second Chronicles. Those of you who are familiar, First and Second Kings and First and Second Chronicles deal with the same periods of history. Chronicles was the P author, the priestly author, right? And Kings was the Deuteronomist author. They have different themes. They tell the story different ways to make different points, right? Much the same way that the 4 gospel authors tell the same story to make a different point, right? They just look at it all quite differently. So we have the historical books trying to make sense of everything that's said in Torah. And we have the prophetic books. And those prophetic writers were trying to understand what was happening in history when the 10 northern tribes were destroyed and when the 2 southern tribes were, I'm going to admit somebody here, when the 2 southern tribes were exiled. But once we get, so the prophets, that's all literature where they're trying to figure it out. So Amos is talking to the 10 northern tribes and saying, look, you're not paying attention to God. You're not trusting God. You're going to be annihilated. Sure enough, they were annihilated. Okay? Jeremiah was telling the people of the 2 southern tribes, Babylon's going to destroy you. All right? It's, if you don't follow God's will, if you don't trust God. So these prophetic authors were all trying to see what's happening to this promise that this great nation of Israel is going to save all the peoples of the earth. Right? The other interesting thing about the prophets is, on the one hand, they all are prophesying the destruction of either the 12 northern tribes or the 2 southern tribes, but they always know there's going to be redemption of some kind. All of them have some sort of vision of hope. Right? And that's because they trust the God of Torah, who is a God who has promised the people to care for them and bring them to a place where they will bless all the peoples of the earth.
Right.
All right? So that's how the prophets are understanding Torah. Then the writings. All right? We're going to go over. We'll go over these, but Song of Songs and the Psalms and Ruth and Esther. These are all stories and poems and wisdom literature like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. They're all trying to be in dialogue with Torah and to understand the God that is offering this promise that the people of Israel will bless all the nations of the earth. They're trying to understand, well, how does this fit together with the way the world is created, with how things unfold? Right? And and sometimes these things disagree. It's one of the nice things about the Bible. It's not really tidy, right? So things disagree with one another. There are at least three creation stories in the Hebrew Scriptures. We have the 2 stories in Genesis, Genesis 1, the poem, Genesis 2 and 3. But then in Proverbs 8, there's another creation story about Lady Wisdom and her place in the unfolding tradition of what God is doing in the world. So it's a very kind of rich conversation that's taken place over thousands of years. It gets edited together, you know, things were pushed out, but other things came in until it becomes a rich tradition. All right? And Gary and Eileen, what I said in the beginning is we're kind of talking about what the Bible is and where it came from. The next two times we'll talk about salvation history. Then we'll talk about how these various writings and prophets understand all that, and then we'll move into the Gospels and the epistles and John. So, all through this history, God is at work. The people of God, that are the people of this book, are trying to understand what's going on. And they argue about it, they debate about it, everything gets put together and edited time and time and time again. All right? So where did the Christian scriptures come from? All right? Well, let's just say for a moment that religions are like languages. All right? You know, languages evolve. You know, they rub up against each other. You know, you get people from Asia living in California long enough, and next thing you know, a lot of Chinese words kind of make it into our language. You know, religions are like languages. They shift, and they move, and they grow, and they develop. All right? So what happens when the Hebrew religion meets the Greco-Roman culture? Right? The answer is, what happens is the conversation, that language develops to the point that a new religion emerges. Right? And the Christian scriptures are an identification. They're the new religion. They're saying, okay, we are living in the Greco-Roman world, and we're going to put on those glasses, and we're going to look at Torah through those. And when we look at Torah through those, we understand Jesus to be a particular thing. We understand God's work in the world to fit the way the Greco-Roman world understands God to work. Right? It's a new conversation that takes place. So it's why I said in the beginning that I find it sad we split from the mother ship. Because really we're all doing the same thing. We're all trying to understand what those initial insights into the nature of God and God's work in the world. We're all trying to understand how Torah applies in our culture and in our time. And that's exactly what Paul was doing, the author of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John was doing. They were all taking this thoroughly Jewish understanding of how God worked in the world and trying to describe it to the Greco-Roman world so that it made sense. Right? It's pretty exciting. And that's where this new religion came from. You know, so you think about that. That's how Christianity started. It's a new culture, a completely new culture and a new worldview. And it started interacting with the Hebrew mindset. And something brand new emerged and developed because God was working in the world. What about now? Would you say that the changes in worldview and philosophical understanding are as dramatic now, moving from mythic Christianity to our current worldview, as they were from the Hebrew mindset to the Greco-Roman mindset? I think they're at least that different. And I think it's demanding of us to listen and to ask, how do we describe those ideas now?
You know, it seems to me that the Jewish religion, though, has really withdrawn into itself rather than wanting to share it with the world, even though we've accepted it and then modified it to, you know, a Christian Greco-Roman, you know, basis. But What happened to the Jewish religion as far as their relationship with everybody else? When did that stop? Did it stop with World War II? And I think it was a problem even before that, wasn't it?
Yeah, Christians have been persecuting Jews for thousands of years. Thousands of years. And it's not surprising that a persecuted people would turn in on itself and protect itself. But the Jewish religion has also developed as well and evolved. You know, my most interesting conversations theologically are with a rabbi friend of mine who, right, and those are some of the most interesting conversations I have. I mean, I edited that book on tears, and I don't think the rabbis of the first century would think that he got it right. You know, it's a conversation that he's having like any religious leader is having now. We're in such an amazing time. You know, the worldview is turned upside down, and we're trying to make sense of these texts because, you know, some people ask me, well, why do you even bother to read that text? It's so old. And my answer is, well, because these people have been wrestling with these questions for thousands of years, and I need to be part of that conversation because otherwise it's just about what I think. And I don't think I'm all that clever. So, and I think I'm also likely to come up with a religion that serves me if I were to make one up, right? Because I think they're right about the concept of sin. I think there's a problem.
So, Pastor, this oral tradition, which of course continued despite the fact that it eventually was written down, when did it start being written down? Any guesses on that?
Well, I mean, that's different for different parts of it, right? So, you know, the Psalms were written down because they were effectively the first, the hymn book of the Second Temple. You know, we assume that Jesus's sayings were written down somewhere, you know, maybe in the 60 A.D., something like that. And then the Gospels came from oral traditions, but they were written traditions. The Pauline letters were written in, you know, what, 50 A.D., 40 to 50 A.D., somewhere in there. Yeah, so I think it's different for different ones. As these things were all edited together, you know, they needed to write them down and they needed to shift and change. That's where an omer is 1/10 of an ephah came from. You know, that was because copyists were copying over and over. So understand there wasn't publishing, but there was copying, and you know, so there was written word for centuries and centuries. Do you find that this challenges your faith, or does it fit your faith?
It challenged the idea that the Bible was written with divine intervention.
Okay. Yeah, it challenges the idea that God dictated.
Yeah.
It challenges the idea that God is not changeable, as I've heard from a lot of Christians.
God's not changeable. Or that God is unwilling to change. That's an interesting question that you just raised. Is God changing as this happens?
He's evolving.
That's what Whitehead would say. Alfred North Whitehead would say that God is evolving, and to the degree that creation is an expression of God's love, that makes a certain amount of sense.
Well, we're kind of aging and maturing, and I'm sure that, I mean, as a human body, there's a lot that keeps on changing, and God works within that, so he can't be static on that either. There's new ways and different ways of looking at everything. It's so much more, expansive and explosive and everything else going on. So, he has a lot going on, say the least.
Yeah, and these things also, also have to do with the gender of God.
Mhm.
You
Mhm.
know, this
Yeah.
congregation refers to God as He a lot. Um, uh, and if you notice that I avoid the masculine pronoun, it's because it's a habit. I have been trained at San Francisco Seminary not to use the masculine pronoun. Um, and I think that's actually a good thing because I think we limit our understanding of the nature of God if we keep God masculine. I think we make a mistake in getting rid of the masculine. I think the pendulum may swing too far, but there's plenty in the scriptures to suggest that there's feminine characteristics and traits to the Godhead.
Richard Rohr uses the term divine one.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very, I guess, receptive to that because a little over a year ago, I had this revelation. My goodness, I'm made in God's image and I am fully woman. That makes God partially woman.
Mm-hmm.
And
Absolutely.
I accepted that, but I accepted it more on an intellectual basis. And this was purely an emotional revelation.
Yeah. And did that make you feel more loved?
Um, Probably through affirmation. Yes,
Yeah,
I
through
would say.
affirmation. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Rohr is somebody I resonate with. Rohr also thinks of everything as evolution. Um,
Mhm.
he's an integralist in his heart of hearts, um, and understanding God in fresh and new ways in our current culture is really important.
I would say instead of God changing, that I see it more as we're perceiving different parts of God and seeing him in different ways as we change. He meets us where we are. And so as we grow and change individually and as a culture and as a people, um, he meets us there. And yeah, I don't see him changing. I see us just seeing different qualities in him.
Hmm. Yeah, and the question of the nature of God, what is God? It's actually a separate question from the one we've been working with right here. And if we say that God is changing, I mean, we can say that that means the nature of God is inextricably tied with creation. And if you say that we're realizing that God is, we're realizing different parts of God, as Peggy just said, well, then what we're saying is that God is a static reality, not something that changes, but that we're the ones that are changing. And there's, I think, uh, a lot of philosophical debate on both sides of that. To what degree does God exist apart from creation? Is, I guess, one way to ask that question. But that gets us into the mind blowing part of faith. When you ask yourself, how come there is something instead of nothing? In fact, if there wasn't something, how come there would be nothing instead of whatever the hell wouldn't be there if there wasn't any nothing?
Mhm.
You can spin your head out at a certain point. And that's and if you think on those things long enough, eventually you will shudder.
Yeah.
And that is the
Yeah.
fear of God. That
Mhm.
that's that awe, fear, shake that those early psalmists understood. What it's like to really respond to Creator, and see how magnificent and huge. And even the early authors who thought the world was flat and there was a dome understood that at a relational level. Why do you suppose our churches are shrinking?
Kind of lack of curiosity and um, just self-directed people that figure that they're going to, live their life with what they see in front of them and not any further. I don't know. Um, they're not questioning their imagination. They're not questioning, you know, what life has.
Okay.
I think that many people don't see a relevance of church in their lives.
Mhm. That's a way to put it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you look at people that nobody wants to open up a Bible and read it and find out what it might have. It's like, you can read all kinds of stuff, but the idea of opening a Bible and actually studying it or trying to, find out what wisdom or what value or what history is offered in it, it's like, it's just amazing. People have no interest. I mean, it's like, I don't know.
Well, let me be the devil's advocate. Okay.
Mhm.
There was that story I preached on Sunday. It could be argued by reasonable, ethical people that a book that has that story in it really ain't worth much. And then there's the awful story with
The
the
book you read, you're going to come across a paragraph or a chapter, you're going to think, well, they didn't need to have that in there, you know? So if that's all you're basing your whole knowledge on it, you're not going to get very far. So that's my thought.
Mm-hmm. There's the concubine that was hacked into 12 pieces. That was a
Oh,
great,
I know. There's things like that that are really gory. Yeah.
you know.
I
So
don't watch those
you
movies.
ask yourself why. I mean, it makes sense to me that people reject it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I
Um,
think it also has to do with style, um, and you get into a mode of worship, and if that's changed, it's almost like their whole world has collapsed. And I've seen the changes happen, of course, through music, because that's been the most pronounced, I think, change in the last 40 years. And but I think that sometimes people um, run from those changes because they can't come to an acceptance of it themselves, or a tolerance, or a thing. God, I'm here. I don't relate to this much, but I'm still here. That type of thinking. I don't know how true that is, but it just, in my posturing, it seems like it is.
I've found over the years that that's why pastors get kicked out of churches, actually. But
Yeah.
they want to change things, and people want to stay. I just wonder whether it doesn't have to do with the idea that we're sticking to the worldview of the Bible in our language about God, rather than embracing the idea that we don't have to hold on to the worldview, but that those people were on to something from within their own worldview. Um, it's like if you insist, for instance, the insistence when I was growing up that Jesus walked on water. or that Jesus was born of a virgin. Well, okay, you can insist that, but in a modernist worldview, you sound a little silly. And I've felt like that's why the church becomes irrelevant. I mean, Plato was born of a virgin, apparently. Many Chinese leaders were born of virgins. I mean, that's kind of what you say about somebody who's amazing.
Many of the Roman emperors are
Yep,
said to.
sure. And the reason I'm bringing it up is because I think how we look at the Bible, the reason I've been talking about it the way I have, is the product of history, the product of the various social forces and economic forces and political forces of evolution. Right? I think if we take it as that, then people can take it more seriously and get something from it. It's when we try and impose this old worldview on the world that things go off base. People can't have a live faith. They're asked to check their brains at the door.
It means we have to work harder.
Yeah, working harder.
It takes a lot of work to interpret and understand,
Yes, it does.
and to make it relate to what you understand.
Yeah, I think it does take some work, and I also think for the people that have rejected it, um, uh, you need to show that it has something to offer. The message needs to have something real.
I agree.
I mean, my wife often says to me after she hears me preach, well, I like the way you interpret it, but really I can't stand it.
I would say that perhaps a lot of examples of those who call themselves Christian in our world fail and are viewed by those considering, should I stay with the Christian faith or not? But look at those people, and they call themselves Christians, and yet look how they act, look how they treat others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, hypocrisy is always one of the reasons that people walk away. Since I think everybody is a hypocrite at some level, I always feel like that's not fair. But it's like it's an excuse. I think that religion is used to try and control people. It's another thing that happens. So if you use these kind of literal interpretations, you pick and choose, you're trying to make people do what you think they ought to do.
Well, a lot of people want that. They don't want to think for themselves or ask questions or question God. They just figure whatever's being told to them is where they're going to be, and that's all they want to, consider. And that's kind of sad to me. If we can't question God, then I don't know. That just, it seems one-dimensional if we aren't really getting into it and being able to challenge what's happening.
Yeah, I think there are fewer and fewer people like that. Most people seem to want to make up their own ethical, moral, theological stance.
Yeah.
That's at least what I've noticed. I have lots of friends in what I call the integral world. It's a philosopher named Ken Wilber who has a particular view that deals with the evolving universe. And, my friends there, I don't think there might be a couple of Christians, well, Roar for one, but they are really trying to wrestle and understand what's the cohesive narrative that gives our lives meaning. That's really what we're asking. And I think that the scriptures have a cohesive narrative that gives our life meaning and purpose and direction that we can be responsible to, you know? And it's fascinating to me to hear others begin to develop cohesive narratives that don't necessarily come out of the scriptures, but then they seem to resonate with the scriptures. I find that fascinating. My wife talks a lot about the myth of separation. You'll hear me talk about it sometimes. You know, that one of the problems in the world is we think we're separate. So my wife talks about the myth of separation, that we're simply not separate. We're all one. And as she talks about, and that part of our work in the world, part of what we're here for is to find a way to be unified with the presence of God and with one another. And so I've been hearing her talk about that for some time. And then I started rereading Romans. And I realized that the Apostle Paul is talking about exactly that. It's what Jews and Greeks is all about for him. That whole fight is about the myth of separation and the need for us to be united in Christ. So it's why I love the Bible, because it gives us this chance to bring a cohesive narrative and listen for what other people are doing, what other people are saying, so that we have something to contribute to them and they to us.
Going back to the question about why people are not coming to church, sometimes I think in our earnestness as Christians that we become so rigid, and you talked about the hypocrisy, and we can be doing some dangerous words, expelling dangerous words that put people off and to put something between us. And that might be the case with some people. I don't know.
So again, I mean, someday you may actually meet my wife. Not 100% sure, but my wife was a therapist for 22 years in Des Moines, Iowa, and she saw what the church could do to people and how faith abused people, and as a result, the word sin is not permitted in our home. All right. Can you see me?
Yes.
So it's not permitted because the word itself has done a lot of damage to people, because it's interpreted in ways and forces people into situations that it shouldn't. So we use the word hamartia, which is Greek for sin, because the concept that's there in the scriptures makes sense to me. But the "you're a sinner" and the tisk 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 stuff, that's dangerous thinking. Hurts people.
Well, then you get into the subject of heaven and hell too. There's so many people that, can't imagine a loving God would send people to hell, and, then what is heaven, and who's eligible? That becomes a big issue too.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that issue barely shows up in the scriptures. Yeah, the two big theological questions that people reject Christianity over, the way I put them is, does God send all Buddhists to hell? I'm not even sure there is a hell. And I just don't deal with a God that allows or disallows suffering. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you have friends that you can talk to outside of the church about these things?
Oh yeah, definitely.
So Pam and Fred are frozen for me right now. This is very interesting that we're as having the kind of problems we are.
Let's see.
Yes.
So we have 12 people on.
Yeah. What's strange to me about this is I have screaming fast speeds right now. Well, I just think it's fun to explore the scriptures because of all this. And so if I have a main point that I really wanted to get across tonight, it's the nature of the Bible. Is that we've been debating and arguing about this thing for 3,000 years. That's how it developed. That's where it came from. And it's our book. That's why I made the point that we can get rid of a verse if we want. It's all part of the conversation. I don't want to get rid of any verses.
Don't say it, please.
Well, but we can. And that's important because it means that the book is alive. It's about our faith, not about what somebody said in the past. So, they're really, though, Pam, aren't there a couple of less verses you'd like to get rid of? How about wives obey your husbands? That one could go.
Oh, yeah.
I do take with context and the time that things are written in and why they're written. I don't see it, as 2020 directions, but the overall morality of it, no, I wouldn't change a thing.
Okay. I think we could find some passages in there that you might challenge you on that. It's pretty violent.
I don't want to try. Would that help?
Yeah. Then the Revelation says, don't change it.
Yeah, but that's just that book.
No.
That's just the Revelation, though.
Yeah.
Not referring to the whole of Scripture.
That's quite a book.
There are some challenging passages in there.
Yeah. Definitely.
Revelation.
And they're just discoveries for me to try and understand in the future, because only pieces open up little bits at a time for me, and so there's always something new to discover and try and understand, and no, I'm good with it.
I mean this. I really mean this in the best possible way. You are reminding me of my mother.
Well, I'm glad you're listening.
And the reason is, my mother had rocks in her head.
I'm sure they were diamonds.
Well, they were rocks, and she described it this way. She would read a passage of scripture that was difficult. She would take this rock down from a shelf in her mind, and she would read the scripture, and she'd look at it for a while. She'd go, yeah, I don't get that. And she'd put it back on the shelf. And then later she'd pick up another rock and look at it. And, sometimes she could grind it into powder. She ground the end of the first chapter of Romans into powder at one point. So that's the one where Paul talks about gay sex. So that. Yeah, I actually, Pam, I actually agree with you. I don't want to get rid of anything because I think the argument is what gives us our faith. So that if there's something I don't like, I get to talk about why. And I get to talk about that in the context of the rest of Scripture. And
well, there's plenty I don't like, but I just wouldn't want to ever be the one to choose.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think what I'm trying to say is at some level you are.
But then that'd be one-to-one with the Lord.
Right. But no, I mean, you are, meaning you're in a group that chooses.
Oh, I'm listening. I like to get near the fire. Doesn't mean I have to jump in.
Okay. When I mean a group, I mean the Presbyterian Church.
I'll go Lutheran much longer.
The Lutherans can pull it too.
Oh, they're very frozen.
Yeah, Martin Luther
Yeah,
wanted to get rid
really.
of James. Martin Luther didn't want the book of James in the
I
canon.
like James.
And because it doesn't talk about Jesus.
Huh.
Yeah, Calvin wasn't crazy about Revelation. You know, it's the only book of the Bible that he did not write a commentary on. John Calvin. He didn't write a commentary on the Revelation of John, and he said that the reason was he didn't want to contribute to the confusion.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So, any questions about what we've said here? Because I'm trying to, because if we understand what the book is and why we're talking about it and why we're arguing about it, then it becomes interesting what it says. Next week we're going to talk about, the Bible has two parts. Okay, some people think it's the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures, and I suppose that's true, but it's hard to tell even when that's the case. So we are going to, next week I'm going to have to figure something out, because this doesn't happen to me. Am I still here?
Yeah.
You're frozen, but we hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
So next week we're going to talk about the first part of the Bible. And the first part of the Bible is Genesis chapters 1 to 11. Okay? Genesis 1 to 11 is the problem, and Genesis 12 to the end of Revelation is God's solution to the problem. So that's what we'll talk about next week. And I'm sorry for the technical difficulties here. I will try and edit this recording and get it up onto YouTube and edit out all of the hey, all of that. See where we go from there. If you have any questions, or if I've said anything that really bothers you, and you'd rather not talk about it in this context, but you'd rather just talk to me, just go ahead and reach out. Send me an email or a text, and I'm always happy to talk. All right.
I have one last question to ask. Have you read any of the Bill Moyers or seen any of the Bill Moyers shows on myth?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Have you drawn upon that? Did you find it helpful in your development of this class?
Well, I don't think that so much that I've drawn upon it. I think I've drawn on the things that he drew on.
Okay.
I think that would be more what I'd say. I'm very resonant with him. I actually found him more helpful when he did his studies on Genesis. All those conversations. Those were fascinating. I had a couple of friends who were actually the scholars on it, on the panels, and I thought those were really, really interesting.
Now, I'm not familiar with that. Is that actually a show, a program that's on,
Well, this would have been years and years and years ago.
30 years ago, that PBS ran them, or not, maybe it wasn't even PBS. It might have been just on general TV. And I can't remember the name of the series, but it was on the myth.
Yeah.
And explored in several different avenues of what myths are.
Right. I wonder whether that stuff might be on YouTube now.
Yeah, I'll look it up.
Yeah.
Been around for a while. Well, folks, thank you very much for being with me through all of this technical snafu. And I will look forward to this Sunday seeing you, and I'll also see you next Wednesday night.
Thank you, Sam.
All right.
Thank you.
Have a
Very
good night, all.
interesting.
Thank you.